All right, we're going to look at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We're working our way through the Bible, and we've come to Ezra and Nehemiah. And we're going to look at these two books together, almost as if they were one book, partly because that's how they have been read for most of history. They've been read together as one book until they were separated into two books sometime in the 2nd century. And I'm not exactly sure why they did that, because clearly they are one book. As you read these two books together, you'll see they're telling one big story. Now, unfortunately for a lot of us, we don't think of that story. The story they're telling is all that interesting. I don't know how many sermons you've heard on Ezra or Nehemiah. Usually, I guess, if you hear a sermon on Ezra, it's a sermon about preaching, and if you hear a sermon on Nehemiah, it's a sermon about leadership. And while Nehemiah definitely does have some things to tell us about leadership, and Ezra has some things to tell us about preaching, these books are in the Bible to accomplish something even ultimately bigger than that. We know they're God's Word. And so, of course, Ezra and Nehemiah are here to be studied so that we can be taught what we need to be taught, corrected, rebuked, instructed, trained in righteousness. But they're also here in our Bibles as part of God's way of revealing how He's going to save us and what He is going to do through Jesus. These two books are part of this great redemptive story that the Old Testament tells. And I think to appreciate how they fit into that story, we have to go back for a minute and get some context. Think a little bit about the biblical story in which these two books are set. What does the Bible tell us about what God is doing so far? How does Ezra and Nehemiah fit into that? Well, of course, we know if we go back, there was creation, God establishing this beautiful kingdom. Then there was the fall, man rebelling and wanting to be his own king. Then there was this whole long history of man really proving that he can't save himself. And just when you would have thought it was all over, God chooses Israel. For God so loved the world that He chose Israel. He elected Israel, and He intended to use Israel to bring blessing to the world. And He made them all kinds of amazing promises. He entered into a covenant with them that was filled with blessings and curses. And of course, we've seen that Israel failed. They did not keep their part of the covenant. And as a result, after a long time of God being patient, He kept His promise to punish them, and they were sent into exile. In a sense, a lot like Adam was sent into exile out of the garden, Israel was sent into exile out of the promised land. And yet, while they were in exile, God raised up prophets who, and even before they went into exile, God raised up prophets who made all kinds of great prophecies about what God would do in the future, how God had not given up on Israel, and how after exile would come something big. And now, as we come to Ezra and Nehemiah, we're asking, what's going to happen next? This is where we're at. It's just at the end of exile. God's made these big promises. What is going to happen next? Now, sometimes it helps to get a little idea of the general chronology. So about 2000 BC, you have Abraham. About 1500 BC, you have Moses. About 1000 BC, you have David. About 721 BC, the northern kingdom is destroyed. And in about 586 BC, the southern kingdom of Judah is exiled to Babylon. The temple is destroyed. You have Ezekiel's ministry and Daniel's as well. And then in 539 BC, Persia, a nation called Persia, conquers Babylon, and their king, Cyrus, allows the Jews to return to Judea. In 538 to 535 BC, they return under Zerubbabel and Joshua, or Jeshua, as he's called in these books. The altar is rebuilt, sacrifices begin, the temple foundation is laid, and then they run into a little bit of hostility, and so they stop rebuilding the temple. In 521, Darius makes a decree that they can actually begin on the temple again, And in 516 BC, the temple is completed and dedicated. 483 to 473 BC, Esther marries Xerxes. 458 BC, Ezra returns. More returnees come with him. Ezra makes some reforms. And about 444 BC, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem and he rebuilds the wall, which means basically these are exciting times. It's been a little bit of a bumpy road. There was up, when God rescued Israel from Egypt, and then there was like down, 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 crashing down when they were sent into exile. And then they're back in the land, and things are starting to happen under Ezra and Nehemiah. And so it almost looks like they're on the up curve. There are definitely some good indications. And so if we look at the book itself, we have some hope at the beginning. And yet there's a lot of stuff we don't know as we read it, of course. Who's the author? Maybe it was Ezra. Probably it was Ezra. Tradition says it was Ezra. And there's not really a good reason to disagree with thousands of years of tradition. He was a scribe, and he had access to royal documents that were used for the writing of Ezra and Nehemiah that most other people wouldn't have had. It's hard to imagine who besides Ezra would have had access to the royal archives of Persia, on which a lot of the documents or some of the documents in these books were based. Ezra 1 to 6, though, tells us about some things that were happening before Ezra. Then chapters 7 to 10 are written clearly in the first person by Ezra. Sometimes those chapters are called the Ezra Memoirs. And then Nehemiah is similar. And there are parts of Nehemiah that seem to have actually been written by Nehemiah. People call those the Nehemiah Memoirs. Other parts might have been compiled by an editor who came a little later, or it might be just that Ezra is the one bringing all this together. There's some things we don't know for absolutely sure, but what we do know is at the beginning of these books, there are a lot of reasons to be positive. First of all, God is clearly on the move. God is at work. If you read Ezra 1:1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Here's a king acting. Why is he acting? Because God's at work, and God's at work to fulfill his word. Ezra 7:6, then Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given, and the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was on him. Nehemiah as well. If you look at Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah is allowed to do something you would never think Nehemiah would be allowed to do, and it's because God is on the move. Godly leaders are at work. There's a lot of reasons to be positive as we begin this book. God is on the move. His promises are being fulfilled. Godly leaders are at work. Ezra 3:2, we see Joshua and Zerubbabel then arouse Joshua the son of Jozadak with his fellow priest, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel with his kinsmen, and they built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. These men were reading Moses, and they sought to obey Moses. They sought to do what Moses wanted them to do. Ezra 9:6, we find Ezra actually praying here. Oh my God, I'm ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. And what Ezra is doing there in these verses that go all the way down to chapter 10, verse 1, is repenting. He's repenting like Daniel. He's repenting like the psalmist. He's crying out to God on behalf of the nation. And he's really acknowledging their guilt. This is huge. Nehemiah, same thing. Nehemiah is clearly a godly man. Nehemiah 1:4-11, when he hears about the difficulties that are going on in Jerusalem. How does he respond? As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. This is exactly what godly people are supposed to do. Depend on God. Be concerned about God's glory. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 4. The king said to me, Nehemiah here is standing before the king, and the king can tell something's wrong. Now, Nehemiah at this point could have only been thinking about his life, because you know these kings, and yet he wasn't. He was thinking about the good of his people. The king says, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. What does Nehemiah do? Even before he makes his request to the king, he depends on God. And over and over and over again, through Ezra and Nehemiah, we see these really are godly men. And there is a great beginning. God is on the move. Godly men are at work. And there's a great beginning to all this. Ezra 1:1 is quite a start to a book, if you think about it. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. That reminds us, obviously, of God's sovereignty over a pagan king, but more specifically, it reminds us of God's faithfulness to his promises. Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 51 records a promise that God made about what he was going to do for his people after exile. And really, in many ways, that first verse where Ezra says that the word of the Lord by the prophet Jeremiah might be fulfilled is a kind of hyperlink back to everything you learned already from Jeremiah and the prophets. Someone has described this little phrase as the prophetic package of hope. In other words, the prophets, like Jeremiah, had promised that Jerusalem would be taken captive, the southern kingdom would be taken captive, but they would come back better. They would come back stronger. This was based on Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 6, where Moses, even before they went into the promised land, Moses in Deuteronomy said, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and he will gather you again from the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. That's a great promise. Moses is saying in the future, if you obey, this is what's going to happen. And Jeremiah picks up on that in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 10 through 14. Jeremiah says, then fear not. Oh, that's Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah 29, 10 through 14. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for wholeness and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I've driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. So again, Ezra, the start of Ezra and Nehemiah is pretty exciting. You have God on the move, you have godly leaders, and you have this great beginning where it looks like the promises that you read in Deuteronomy 30, Jeremiah, that they're starting to be fulfilled. And really, Ezra assumes you are familiar with all that. You're familiar with this prophetic package of hope. You're familiar with what the people were expecting based on the promises, that the prophecies that were made. You're familiar. He assumes you're familiar with what they were expecting to happen. So they were expecting, Isaiah 11, a future messianic king after exile. They were expecting God's presence in the temple, Ezekiel 40 to 48. They were expecting God's kingdom to be exalted over the nations, Isaiah chapter 2, Zechariah 8. They were expecting the fulfillment of all the promises to Abraham. And so what question are we asking as we read through this book? We're asking, is this it? Is this the time it's going to happen? Is this the beginning of the end? Return, rebuild, nations come, and the Messiah rules. That's what you kind of expect after reading Ezra 1:1. And for a while, it really looks like it's going to happen. Yet, for a book that begins so well, there's a very surprising end. Ezra 1 to 6, you have Zerubbabel and the temple. Ezra chapter 7 through 10, you have Ezra 60 years later, the Torah, and the community. Nehemiah chapter 1 through 7, you have Nehemiah rebuilding the city and the walls. Nehemiah 8 through 12a, you have this covenant renewed with God, and you have the people saying, we're going to do this. So you have the temple, you have a leader, you have a king, a governor at least, you have a descendant of David who's leading, you have Ezra, you have the seriousness about God's word, you have the city being rebuilt, and you have the people coming before God and saying, we want to be faithful to the covenant. That sounds pretty good. Until Nehemiah 12, the second half of Nehemiah 12 and chapter 13. And Nehemiah ends with the temple being neglected, the walls being torn down, and the Torah being ignored. And I think that helps us actually understand the purpose of these books. Ezra and Nehemiah, as someone has put it, are a case study when well-intentioned leaders do everything to prepare for a revival and it fails. It fails. And really, I think the argument of the book is we can't save ourselves. Israel can't save themselves. We can't generate revival. We have to receive it as a gift. We need something more. We need someone more. This is kind of actually what Jesus was telling Nicodemus. Remember, Nicodemus he didn't learn the lesson of Ezra and Nehemiah when he came to Jesus, and what he thought is we can do this. We can prepare ourselves for the Messiah by being good enough and by being moral enough. That was the whole Pharisaic code. And yet, what does Jesus say to Nehemiah? No, if you're going to see the kingdom, you know what you need? You need a new birth. And he should have known that from Ezra and Nehemiah. The whole book is you can do your best, but it probably won't work out the way you want it to because of the problems with the human heart. So you're to finish this book really with this almost attitude of desperation. God, change my heart and send your Messiah to fix us. That's Ezra and Nehemiah. That's essentially how the story of the Old Testament ends.